Sir Jeremy Farrar is actually online, and he's going to speak with us next. His CV's too long to read. It would take half of the talk, but suffice it to say that he's the chief scientist with the WHO, and Kirsty's already alluded to his terrific advice for all of us. So, Jeremy, are you able to hear us?
Yeah, no, I can hear you.
And welcome to Down Under. We don't have any furry animals with us like they did in Brisbane. And I believe that you're going to speak with us without slides, which is a rare skill. I'm guessing that you're either a philosopher or a lawyer in a previous life.
No, in the previous life, I was a neurologist in Melbourne for some silly reason. But pleasure to join. I just caught Kirsty's halfway through Kirsty's speech and gathered that anybody over the age of 35 is just getting started. So it's good to be starting. And also pay tribute to Kirsty for that meeting in Brisbane, which, as many people did earlier on, was hugely, it was a fantastic meeting, informative for me. It's a long time since I've joined an options meeting, but it was also great fun. And I think the idea that you would be organising it in Brisbane and having to somehow link up with some really nice people, but in London, just shocks me, I have to say.
So we'll let you talk about disease X.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Thanks very much again for the invitation. If you didn't catch the first few minutes, no slides, and I won't speak for the whole time because I appreciate you're a bit behind, and I'm going skiing this afternoon, so I need to get finished and get on to it. So, as is obvious to everybody in this audience, we are living and have been for about 25, 30 years, and obviously before that as well, and in an era where epidemics and pandemics are going to be far more frequent and more complex. And my first involvement in this really was in relation to the outbreak of Nipah virus in Malaysia in 1999. But I guess in some ways, it really started a few years earlier than that with the outbreak of Hendra virus, obviously related to Nipah in Australia in 1994. And if you look back to that's 30 years ago now since the Hendra virus outbreak and then Nipah 99, so 25 years since then, and you just plot the number of episodes that have been either regionally or globally disruptive, it is remarkable how common and how frequent they become, but also because of how complicated they've become. Everybody will remember the trauma and the horror of either being involved in or watching from a distance the Ebola outbreaks of 2014 to 2016. And it's really, I think, important to remember that the Ebola virus obviously does change. The Ebola virus not being in West Africa before 2014, but that wasn't really the reason for what at that time seemed like a horrific epidemic. 11,000 people lost their lives over a period of about 18 months. It wasn't the virus, though, that had driven the change. It was the social construct in which it had happened, having previously had multiple, as actually happening today in Uganda with the Sudan strain. It was the social construct that Ebola was happening in a new community where it was not isolated in rural communities, but was allowed to, or did spread from rural communities into big urban centres. And it was that amplifying event that in big urban centres where the social construct and the society's willingness and questioning of authority is different to a rural construct, that allowed the Ebola outbreak to spread across 3-4 borders and cause devastation of a whole region. So go back to MERS in the Middle East, SARS-1, which I was very involved in Vietnam during 2003 or so, coming of H5N1, 97, and then again 2003, and again we can come back to H5N1 in the United States at the moment and how that's being dealt with. Zika virus, of course, COVID we can't ignore. But it's a pattern, and the pattern is that these are the symptoms of something that is happening far more profound in our world. And one of my concerns in the scientific community is we are, and I see this now in WHO, we are either vaccinologists, or we're therapeutic developers, or maybe epidemiologists or surveillance, or we're climate change people or biodiversity people, we're looking at urban development. And the reality is, somewhere and somehow we're going to have to bring these communities together if we're going to address, because otherwise we will be continuing to react to the symptom of that changing world: climate, biodiversity, change of natural habitats, wildlife trade. I can come back to the wildlife trade as a key driver, I think, of this, the incredibly professional wildlife trade, particularly around Asia, but more broadly, including Africa and Central and South America. That wildlife trade, which is linked to prostitution and to people movement and migration, illegal drugs and synthetic opioids and all sorts of other things, an incredibly professional network which is driving one aspect of that, the wildlife trade across borders and across regions, which is deeply worrying. And then, of course, the human-animal interface, which we're seeing increasingly breaking down, and observing what is happening somewhat from a distance on H5N1 in the United States at the moment is deeply, deeply concerning. We have watched an animal pandemic, for want of a better word, spread of H5N1 around the world over the last few years. When the H5N1 is infecting your average seal, it's tragic for the seal, but a seal doesn't come into contact with humans very often. But now we've let the H5N1 come into animals that are in very direct, very close, intimate contact with humans in the dairy population in the United States. And the dairy community is often migrant workers with social issues, and some of them working illegally. That's a complex social construct to work in. And then on top of that, you've got a fragmented system in the United States at the moment between the federal, the state, between human health, animal health, agriculture, environment, human. And that's a difficult, fragmented structure, which when you're trying to create a cohesive response to an epidemic makes it extraordinarily difficult. I don't know where in the last 3 months the coming of the Australian Centre for Disease Control is, but I would really counsel or hope that can be, if it's going to go forward, it can be something that pulls various strands of multidisciplinary together, so that the fragments that occur in so-called peacetime are not there when you come into a crisis. Because every time, at least I've been involved in epidemics, if you have, and you know you have, a fragmented system prior to the coming of an epidemic or pandemic, whatever happens before, when a pandemic or crisis hits, those fragments and those tensions and that lack of friendship, professional and personal, between people in different disciplines really comes to the fore and thwarts the ability to respond to anything. So I think those primary underpinning drivers we are either going to have to address those, or we'll be constantly responding to the epidemic and public pandemic type potential. The other, of course, is lab safety, and this is a complex issue. I was working on this with the Nuclear Threat Initiative back in 2015, and trying to bring together, through the Munich Security Conference, the biological community and the security apparatus and spy community, really, because I thought they could learn something from each other. And there is no doubt that lab safety must remain absolutely paramount. And with the explosion of the number of BSL category 2 and 3 labs around the world now, and 4, that will become increasingly important. But it'll also become increasingly important because of the developments, very concerning, around synthetic biology. And I'm sure many of you read an article at the end of last year about mirror biology and the coming potential for that, for new entities to be developed, and along with artificial intelligence. So we are living in an era when I think we're just going to have to get used to these epidemics and pandemics being more frequent and more complex. But I would implore that we also do address the underpinning drivers of this, rather than constantly providing reactive responses to it. Surveillance, of course, has improved, and some will argue that it's surveillance that's driven the identification of these, and surveillance is absolutely critical. But I've been quoted before to say surveillance is beautiful, and some of my best friends are surveillance people and working in epidemiology. But surveillance is stamp collecting unless you then are willing and able to do something about it, either through interventions, non-pharmacological interventions, social interventions, and we know the complexity and difficulties of those in the post-pandemic COVID era, or you've got to have diagnostics, treatment, and vaccines. And that's where I think now moving on to disease X and picking up some of the comments from Helen and Kirsty as well, that's where I think the major work has to be done. We mustn't forget those social interventions, and we've got to do much more scientific work rather than hand-holding and hand-waving around what social interventions mean and understanding the social constructs and social behaviour. So it's not should not be a sort of softy, touchy social science background. It's critical that that becomes part of our thinking. If you could have been better in the first 6 months of 2020 in terms of our social interventions and bringing society with us, I think we would have had, at least outside Australia, Australia had a very different pandemic to where I was in the UK at that time, then I think many lives would have been saved in 2020. So we mustn't ignore that or think we're going to bring it in at a later date. But most of what I'll say will relate to treatment and vaccines. So disease X, I remember, in fact, it's one of those moments where you remember where you were sitting in a room at the time when something happened. And I remember it was in February 2018, which is what now 7 years ago, sitting in chairing an expert group here in Geneva, actually, of what had become the R&D blueprint for epidemics that was established in 2015. And in February 2018, there was a desire to pull together a group of priority pathogens that WHO would advise or hope that the world would take on in terms of research, development, and production of countermeasures, therapeutics or vaccines, and diagnostics against a series of priority pathogens, which were not going to be addressed otherwise because there were market failures. It's extraordinarily difficult to produce vaccines and therapeutics for things that may not happen. That isn't a typical commercial model. And this is where the public sector becomes just so absolutely critical in underpinning the basic science, the discovery science, as well as the subsequent phase clinical trials and subsequent manufacturing. And we still have not sorted that situation out. And these priority pathogens, which may never happen, of course, or may happen in such small numbers and can be brought to a close hopefully quicker than that, it still requires a question amongst ourselves about how that is going to get funded. And again, I'll come back to that at the end, because I think we have to raise the issue of what is happening in science in the United States at the moment. But in May 2015, after or sort of during the horror of the Ebola outbreak in 2014-15, the R&D blueprint team at WHO was established, and along with some colleagues, I'm sure in this room, I was chairing that advisory group. And then in 2018, Disease X had its first birth. It's passed into legend that Disease X was a well thought through idea and came with a lot of intellectual heft. It was actually just a comment from somebody sitting at the back of the room that said, what would we do about something we've never heard of or don't know about? And even I remember the person quoting Donald Rumsfeld about the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns and the unknown knowns and all whatever he said. And that ended up saying, well, let's just call it X for now and we'll work it out later. And that passed into being called Disease X as becoming, I think it was a very important, but not particularly well thought through or intellectually argued concept, though, of basically saying we know the pathogens that we know about, and we mustn't ignore those, because whether it's the Ebola viruses or the flaviviruses or whatever it is of the world, we do have to find solutions for those in terms of therapeutic and vaccine interventions, and they mustn't fall off the radar. And of course, to many extent, they have done. But there is the potential, particularly with the drivers of climate and biodiversity, all the things I mentioned at the start, of diseases coming which we've never heard of. I'm not personally sure whether I would call COVID or SARS-CoV-2 a disease X, given that we knew all about coronaviruses and we'd had at least 2 previous dry runs with SARS-1 and MERS in the Middle East. But nevertheless, it gets close to being a disease X. The disease X of my professional career obviously has been HIV, it's not a fixed concept. It's about dealing with something which is unexpected, which you had not previously put high on your list, but which you know, if it were to happen, could be hugely disruptive, particularly if it came into a community, as did COVID-2, of course, which has limited population level immune landscape. So disease X, I think, is an important concept in terms of then pushing an agenda which, as far as I'm aware, hadn't really been publicly articulated about the need to think of something like disease X, not as a specific, we're making a vaccine, as we just heard, for Meningococcal B or for strep B or for gonorrhea, which everybody clearly in the room is closely intimately associated with. But you're going to create a platform which is proven in terms of its ability to produce, let's say, a vaccine in future by prior knowledge, as for instance with mRNA and the COVID vaccines, which has a safety profile that you know about, and critically and often ignored because it can get into the bits that people like certainly myself and perhaps some of you find a bit boring, which is the regulatory and manufacturing pathway and the subsequent logistics and cold chains. All of those are absolutely critical to thinking through those platforms. And so I do think that concept of disease X, for something we may not know about or which may really surprise us, but we must make sure that we're not reacting to it in a way that takes years when we may only have days and weeks to, was a really important step forward. And of course that led the R&D blueprint and an article in the New England, I think in about 2015, talking about the establishment of a global network, a global fund equivalent for vaccines for epidemic diseases, given the understanding that in reality this was never going to be done in the commercial sector on its own, and it had to have public funding support. And I think that remains true today as it was in 2015 at the time of that New England article. So the disease X that we now have in the approach and the priority pathogen list through the WHO has been updated just recently, and I think it is a very reasonable way of going forward. And I hope that in 2025 there will be this network of what I hope will become collaborating centres around the world, network together where each one is taking on either a platform or a viral family, or in some other way collaborating so that we can combine the great skills that are around the world rather than everybody doing this individually. There is never going to be enough money to cover all of the priority pathogens plus disease X in a platform approach if everybody in every country or centre works on their own in isolation. So the idea of bringing a network together, which has come out of the R&D blueprint team here in Geneva, I think is a really good one. And the shift to families with certain groups around the world working on individuals within that families, but nevertheless sharing the experience across in a public good sort of way, I think is the way forward if we're going to move this forward on the priority pathogens we know about, but also on the disease X's. But as part of that, and this is, I think, a role where WHO does have a unique role. I think in the main, WHO needs to be a facilitator of stuff rather than a doer of stuff. But I think on this, WHO does have a critical role, and that is to encourage those academic or industrial centres that are doing this work to make sure they and we also think, what does it pull through into? What does it pull through into in terms of regulatory pathway, safety profiling, assays that need to be developed so that they can be shared, testing in diverse populations around the world through clinical trials, and then critically, the logistics, manufacturing, distribution that allows us to have a better approach than we frankly did during COVID and a more equitable distribution of vaccines. I do believe that there is progress in this, and the fact that in Uganda last week, the Ebola vaccine trial for Sudan variant was started, and first volunteers in that were enrolled in clinical trials. That would never have happened 10, 15 years ago, I have to say. And the shifting of this idea that was true 10 or 15 years ago, that the concept of clinical and public health research in the context of an epidemic was unethical, has I think now been turned on its head, and the statement that at least I would believe in now, is that it's unethical to not do clinical and public health research in the context of an epidemic. And I think that has now become accepted practice. And so it was a real pleasure, I have to say, joy in some ways, amongst a horrific situation in Uganda, especially with everything happening in that part of the world at the moment, that a Sudan variant Ebola vaccine was started as a clinical trial, which is just absolutely critical if we're going to move towards a phase, in my view, of having at least healthcare workers in areas of Ebola risk being offered vaccination as a preventative approach. The last thing I'll say on this is I don't believe in the next decade, in this golden age of science, it's going to be science and technology which is going to limit our ability to make the science make a difference to people's lives in a more equitable way. It will be the challenge we have at the moment, which is a societal trust, trust in science, the role of science in society as part of our culture, and the ability to sustain science and manufacturing for diseases for which there is no commercial driver, which includes all epidemics in essence. That is our biggest challenge. And I think the comments, I think it was Kirsty, and some of the questions from her talk came about how we're going to address that, which leads me straight on to finish off now on what is happening in the United States. I think when we talk about this scientific endeavor in terms of global health and global cooperation, then we cannot currently ignore what is happening in the United States. We don't know the direction of travel for the new administration. It's only been in authority now for about 3 weeks, but its impact on science, I think, cannot be ignored with what is happening at USAID and may be happening at the National Institutes of Health and is already happening at the National Science Foundation, and with executive orders, for instance, issued, if you haven't seen it, for South Africa yesterday, and the impact on health in all regions of the world. But the impact on science will also be profound. We sincerely hope here at WHO that the United States will revisit their decision to intend to withdraw from the World Health Organization, but we also have to address the issue of what is going to happen in science, given the United States scientific superpower, which it is. There are opportunities that will come from this, and I think Australia is absolutely perfectly placed to consider what it will do in science in the future in the light of a likelihood that science will change its cult nature in the United States over the coming few years. That is deeply worrying, I think, for science, given the United States' role in science globally. But it is also an opportunity in the sense of other countries stepping up. But that means us persuading, as scientists, national governments in other parts of the world, that science is an absolutely critical part of society, that science is an absolutely critical part of national resilience, of national security, but also it's a critical part of how a country operates and its future economic growth, as well as the health of its population. We are at a sort of inflection point in this scientific golden age when we have counter forces which are against science. We can't deny that or ignore it, and it's now coming not just through social media, but it's also coming in approaches to government, to science. And I think as a community, we don't yet know what to do. I agree with Kirsty on that, but we don't have long to think about that. And I think we have to come together and think, where does science fit into society? How are we going to address the issues if one or more large countries withdraw from international agencies, but also withdraw from science as we know it today? What are we going to do as a scientific community to defend that science, make sure that the societies we're part of appreciate the science that's done, are part of the science that's done, and that the science that we do addresses the common challenges they face, rather than just in the abstract of future developments. That's a huge challenge for us. But if we don't rise to that challenge, if we're passive, then I fear the future of science in our society is going to be severely damaged and will take many years, if not decades, to rebuild. So in your conversations over your glass of whatever you drink in Australia, I think this should be part of our conversations now about how we're going to address the impact of this era at a national level now of a change in our approach to science nationally and globally. And if we're quiet and we're passive, then I think we will face a very, very difficult future. So with that optimistic thought, I'll end. I'm sorry there are no furry animals, but pleasure always to join anything in Australia, and a wonderful year in Melbourne I always thank you for. Thank you.
See, no? Are you able to hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, terrific, thank you. I was just saying that we're actually following your suggestion and already drinking some stuff that's a bit stronger than the cup of tea that you've got. I'm hoping you might just have a couple of minutes to answer any questions that the audience might have. Yes. Maybe if we take 3. And there's one here.
Can you hear me? Yep, there we go. Look, thanks for a great talk. There's anecdotal evidence in Australia here that our government puts investment, around 97% of our investment, in response and recovery, and around 3% in preparedness and prevention. So you know, everything that you've talked about in the lead up is so important when we're making those arguments around our insurance policy. What sort of arguments have you made nationally, internationally, to help sway our politicians that they need to be more upfront loading rather than at the back end loading when it comes to strategic investment in this problem that we have?
Yeah, so as you can either say it cynically or streetwise, you can make your own mind up, but I think the case that doing good stuff in science is good for you and why everyone should just understand that, and it may improve health, I think that's finished. Honestly, I don't think I actually don't think it's persuaded any politician, even good politicians, for quite some time. I think we have to make that case, but then I think we have to make the case that actually this is the only way that a country can maintain its economic future, provide jobs for the future, particularly for young people, and so essentially not lose the health argument, but also add this critical economic argument, which I think is very true. I mean, obviously Australia has an enormous consumer, whatever it is, mineral wealth and all the rest of it that it can export. But ultimately, science is a key part of its GDP, and that is I think a case we need to make much more strongly. We will be launching this year an initiative or commission, whatever you want to call it, at WHO, which is asking 2 questions. The first one is using domestic resources with a particular focus on middle-income countries, but many high-income countries have wanted to join as well. Using your domestic resources, what are the best ways of investing in science to improve the population's health, but critically, more importantly, to provide economic growth? There are different models around the world. You've experimented in Australia, and many others have, but I think we need to get back to how do you use your X percentage of GDP in your scientific endeavour in order to build economic growth, national resilience, and contribute to national security, whilst also improving, of course, health. And the second bit is how do countries structure their scientific advice into government? If we leave policymaking and politicians on their own, they may make stupid decisions. And having scientists better involved in that, and literate scientists, as well as scientifically literate policymakers, I think is crucial. That's not a short-term fix, but I think those are 2 questions that will be part of this commission going forward. And of course, Australia is a very rich country, probably doesn't need to look at itself like that, but I know you've done a lot of experiments in how to support science, and obviously we'd welcome Australia being part of this. And I have spoken to the Australian government about it. So, but I think we need to learn that new context we're in and appreciate that we need in some ways to respond to that new winds, and not just continue to make the case we made in the past, which I think won't land particularly well in the future.
Thank you. Rod?
Testing. Yeah, Rod Pearce, Chair of the Immunisation Coalition. Appreciate you coming on, and hope you get a good ski run this afternoon. Thank you. I just, reflecting on Elon Musk being the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, but some other private investment in the Bill Gates Foundation and alternatives. My question is, if the government's not going to step up which we're getting pretty pessimistic about the USA experience. What are the other infrastructures that can support WHO and other international projects, and do you have much optimism, or where do you see that coming from?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people have gone back to, I wasn't here then, 2016 and the previous administration here, but of course the world was different in 2016, profoundly different. Europe was in a different place, the world's economies were a different place. So the economic hardships that are being felt, you're probably protected a bit in Australia, but most around the world are facing really challenging times with stagnant growth and huge domestic challenges. And, that's certainly true in the UK, it's certainly true in Europe. So I cannot see multiple other countries who previously would have stepped up with additional funding stepping into that space. I think philanthropy and obviously given my background in that space, obviously a lot of conversations, including one coming this week with major philanthropy from Gates to Wellcome to Novo Nordisk to Bloomberg and others about that. But philanthropy, in my view at least, shouldn't replace what the public purse should do. It can catalyze, it can fill gaps. Sometimes it can help pull through things. It can take greater risk. But if philanthropy steps in too much, then government will, very nicely step away from it. And once they step away from it, it's extraordinarily difficult to get them back. So I think we need to use philanthropy as a catalyst, as a risk taker, as access to capital in ways that public sector cannot do, but to make the case that public sector investment is absolutely critical. And again, coming back to national resilience, economy and security as driving forces of that. And in this increasingly polarized nationalistic world, countries are on their own. This is a lesson that the continent of Africa learned during COVID. We can no longer rely on the global north in any equitable way. And I think Australia needs to look at that. Obviously, all other countries need to look at that and how you would prepare for a crisis like that. But the best way of preparing for a crisis is what you do in peacetime. And if you haven't established those structures and funding mechanisms in peacetime, they certainly won't be with you for you when a crisis hits. And we have to persuade governments, to the earlier question, not to just be in response and recovery mode, but actually it's what you have before something hits that is your capacity to deal with it when it does hit. And we're in this age when there's going to be multiple crises. Industry is the other element, of course, and but industry and WHO, I think are much closer today than they used to be. But still, it's a slightly different relationship. And lastly, WHO also needs to look at itself very strongly and ask itself what its key role in the world is with its member states, and how can it best do that at the highest quality, delivering its unique mandate, and then facilitating the work of others who may be better placed to deal with implementation and other things. So I think out of every crisis comes an opportunity, and the opportunity is to say, this ain't going away, and how can we reform to be better at our core unique mandate so that we're respected for that, and how can we facilitate the work of others where there may be others better able to do. This is inevitably an opportunity to rethink that in ways that when you're not facing a crisis, you sometimes don't do.
So Jeremy, thank you very much for your time, for your thoughts and your insight and your leadership. And our hearts are with you in terms of the well-being of the WHO. Obviously, if there's anything we can do from little old Australia, let us know. But it's an international crisis rather than just a localised one. Thank you.
Can I just come back, just really finish really quickly on that, on what you can do? The loss of funding is one thing, and we'll somehow deal with that. The other is the loss of expertise. The United States provides incredible expertise to the WHO, and at the moment it seems that's under question. One request would be through the Australian collaborating centres or through experts in academia or industry. It would be great to have another call with you to think about how Australian expertise, clinical trials, intensive care units, vaccinology, virology, etc., could be available more to us to fill the gap in expertise. That would be a request back to you, which we would very, very much welcome.
Thank you. We'll disseminate that request, and thanks again for your time.